Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us on VIFF Connect. My name is Kyle Fossner, and I'm the Executive Director of VIFF. I'd like to start by giving thanks to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations for their continued stewardship of the ancestral and occupied lands on which we live and work. VIFF is committed to honoring the land and its stewards by collaborating with and supporting Indigenous artists, filmmakers, curators, and audiences. Celebrating showrunners, directors, writers, producers, and craftspeople, the VIFF Talk series brings you the very best key creatives working today. Whether they're responsible for critically acclaimed films or groundbreaking TV series, our guests provide a treasure trove of information and inspiration for fellow creators and, of course, the fans. The VIFF Talk series is supported by Creative BC, and our community broadcast partner is Telus. This year's talks will take us behind the scenes of some incredible films, including The Many Saints of Newark, My Name is Polly Murray, The Green Knight, Suicide Squad, Flea, and Stories That Transform Us. We'll also look at fantastic small screen works like Mayor of Easttown, Rutherford Falls, Family Law, and British Columbia, An Untold History. A very warm welcome to our guests and to our audiences. Enjoy the show.
Hi, everybody. My name is Duana Taha. I am a television screenwriter and producer, and I'm your host for this evening's talk. I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This evening's talk is supported by the Pacific Screenwriting Program and Creative BC. And now I have the pleasure of welcoming our guest for tonight, Sierra Teller Ornelas. Hi, Sierra.
Hi, how's it going?
She has worked on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Superstore, Happy Endings, Splitting Up Together, Surviving Jack, and Selfie. She is the co-creator and the showrunner of the Peacock show Rutherford Falls. Her work has also been featured on This American Life, in the New York Times opinion section, and in The Hollywood Reporter. A graduate of the University of Arizona, she has worked as a film programmer for the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, and she's also an award-winning sixth-generation Navajo tapestry weaver. Sierra, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Before I start, Sierra Ornelas Tabahendishle, Nakadin Ebashishi, Tuaklina Dishuche, Do Nakadin Additionally. My name is Sierra Teller Ornelas. I am Edgewater, born for the Mexican people, a member of the Navajo Nation, and thank you so much for having me here today.
Absolutely. Well, I am so excited to talk with you about Rutherford Falls and about the craft that goes into it. And I know a lot of fans want to know all kinds of things about the show. I'm going to start kind of top level. Because, you know, are you in LA? Is that correct?
I am in LA, yes.
So you're in LA, and of course, the show is about Native Americans and Native peoples and the land that they're sharing. And yet, why are you so obsessed with the Canadians? You have Michael Grey Eyes, who's Canadian. You have Dustin Milligan, who's Canadian. There's a Property Brothers reference. There's an Atlanta Miles reference, even. Why do you love us so much, Sarah?
I mean, it's so hard. Who doesn't love a Canadian? No, I feel like we did a good job, though, of actually hiring people from the States, because I feel like there's so many shows with Native people, and we were like, we have to do. Weirdly, COVID was in our favor because we couldn't bring in lots of actors from Canada, and we actually found a lot of amazing actors here in the States, Native actors specifically. But I mean, who doesn't love Canada? It's our friends from the North.
I mean, we're thrilled to hear you say it. There's poutine being delivered to you as you speak. Just look out for the drones.
Well, I used to be a film programmer at the National Museum of the American Indian through the Smithsonian, and we programmed a lot through, Imaginative and different Native film festivals. And Indigenous people up there just always felt like Indians from the future. It was like, this is where we'll be in 50 years. We'll all be wearing black and look super chic. And like, I remember just thinking it was like, this is the future. So...
I mean, it's obviously it's complicated. And thank you for pointing out. But yeah, we flip back and forth between the use of the word Indigenous versus you guys use Native.
And I mean, no disrespect by that use of that
course not. And I'm using Native because that's what you use in the show.
Right.
But you really teed me up because you were talking about where you had worked before. And, you know, this, again, is a show about best friends. It's a show about the lies in history. It's a show about all kinds of things. Sierra, this is a show about museum people.
Yes, indeed. It is.
Can you tell us when you realized, wait a minute, museum people are a special type of people that actually need to be discussed and kind of focused on in their own particular way?
I mean, I can't even imagine. My mother is named Barbara Teller Ornelas. She's a master Navajo tapestry weaver. And so I grew up in museums. She was an artist in residence at this Native museum in Phoenix called the Heard Museum. And she had done like demos at, you know, Denver Art Museum. We lived in England for a little while. She did this residency at the Museum of Man. And so I grew up, you know, my brother learned to walk on the steps while she was doing demos. I like would always befriend the security guards. So I've just been around museum people my whole life, and getting to work at the Smithsonian for 7 years, we are like a very specific bunch. And when I connected with Mike and Ed about the show, really getting to talk about all of my experiences working in museums, it was a cavalcade of stories.
And they were like, we had no idea that museum people were this interesting.
I mean, I think they had an inkling. They're both very smart people, but I had a lot of the good dirt. I had a lot of the deep cuts, so.
I love it. Well, there's a great line where somebody tells Nathan Rutherford, the main character, the past is a young man's game, which just made me laugh out loud. But is that like a sentiment that you actually brought from sort of your scholarly and museum-oriented past work?
Not necessarily. I think it's very complicated to be an Indigenous person working in a museum because we were like the artifacts not too long ago. And so it's such an interesting kind of perspective, but I really like when the show came out, I was so focused on how Indian country felt about it. I was so surprised how much museum country loved it. There were so many museum people that like, she got this part right. And oh my God, this is so great. And so I was like, so pleased with all of the different sort of like Twitters that were popping up that were so excited for the show to exist.
Well, I want to get to those various Twitters, but I want to spend a little time on you. You've told a story a couple of times about the provenance of your middle name. I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about where that name comes from.
Sure. My mother's maiden name is Teller, and she put her maiden name in both of my brother and I's names. And a couple hundred years ago in the 1800s, the Navajo were interned at this fort called Bosque Redondo. So we had the Long Walk, which is sort of like our Trail of Tears. We were all displaced in this fort. We were all given Christian names and census numbers. So it was like a messed up Ellis Island sort of situation. And much like in Ellis Island, a lot of the names were based on people's occupations. And so they asked my great-great-grandfather what his job was. And he said, I'm the keeper of stories for my people. I'm a storyteller. And so that's why his last name was Teller. And so it was always one of those things where everyone talked a lot about like passing down my mother's art form. But I really feel like I'm so proud to be carrying on my family tradition of storytelling. And just always kind of be underlined that like Native people have been telling stories for thousands of years.
So then maybe my next question is has kind of an obvious answer, but when we think about tellers or storytellers and people who have that sort of in their background, you don't necessarily go, and you know where we're going to do this is on like network television and or streaming sites. Like what made you know what, my venue is comedy. My venue is, workplace comedies or sort of gentle streaming services, or what was sort of your indication that like, no, this is where I'm supposed to be?
Oh, I've just always loved television. Like ever since I was a little kid, I think working with my mom, but as a kid, I sort of did work for my mom. She would weaving is a very sedentary art. And so she'd be weaving for like 14 hours a day sometimes. And so we were binge watching before that was a thing. She would give me like $20 and be like, go to the video store, buy all the new releases and come back and we'll watch all of them. Or we would watch whole seasons of TV. And she loved those stories. My grandfather loved like F Troop. We just watched so much television. And I also just think Native people are super funny. Like we're just a funny people all around in different ways, in specific ways. But yeah, so I always wanted to write for television. My mom told me a story about in second grade, my teacher called us in and told her, like, basically telling her to like have me dream smaller, that she keeps talking about making television and like it's never going to happen because that's impossible. So like you need to kind of, she's really smart. We should try to focus her on something that's more realistic. And my parents had to kind of debate as to what to do. And my mom's like, just let her dream. Like, what does it hurt? Like, she's some chubby kid in Tucson. Like, even if it doesn't happen, it's not a big deal. And then it did. So yeah. But I mean, I think TV is a very intimate medium. It's like in everyone's homes and it's on everyone's phones. And I think that there are changes to culture that happen, not solely because of television, but I do think it moves the needle in such a way. And as I got to write for television, you really realize sort of the messages you're creating in terms of like how women are depicted, how men are depicted, whatever, everything. And so to get to do that and eventually tell my own story from my own perspective about my people was just like, it was the dream. It's always been the dream and the goal.
If you kind of scroll back to that day when you were told, go rent all the videotapes, and I appreciate you sort of putting us at a place in time. What do you remember? Like, what's a real standout or a kind of a seminal shaping show for you, or a movie?
I mean, my dad really believed, like, he wanted to be a stand-up and he believed that there were like certain movies you had to watch, like, to be a person. And so, I mean, like Psycho, 2001 Space Odyssey, Michael after Michael Corleone, so The Godfather was like a huge movie. There was a comedy called Soap that was like a mixture of it was like a parody of a soap opera. And I remember watching that and it ended on a cliffhanger and it got canceled. And I remember being like viscerally affected by that. Dick Van Dyke Show, A Different World. Just, I mean, I really watched everything. And I would tape them and rewatch them, but Living Single, Amen. Really, the NBC comedy block was like my dream scenario. Night Court. I loved a workplace comedy.
Oh, yeah.
I loved Wings and Cheers. Not everyone likes Wings, but I loved Wings. Trying to think of what else. But yeah, I loved workplace comedies, kind of weirdos. I mean, we loved Northern Exposure because that was all there was at the time. But I remember that being like a seminal moment in my life, and I always wanted to like have the camera just keep following the native characters. They usually had like the downbeat and then they would leave and Joel, we'd follow him. But I remember always just being like, I just want to stay with these characters. And Regan in many ways is like kind of my Valentine to that, of getting to stay with the native character. But yeah.
So then, you do, as you say, it happened. You go on, you become a TV writer and you have this storied career. You're on Happy Endings and Superstore and Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And then, whatever, your colleagues, Mike Schur, Ed Helms, they've done a couple things. They're fine. So
a lot of single season canceled shows. So it wasn't just all, you're skipping some very nice shows. Yes.
Which, I mean, that is the ballad of the TV writer. And anybody who's listening should know that the single season canceled show, or the pilot that almost was, is an important part of the journey. So then you partner up though with these guys. What's the Venn diagram of what you guys all find funny or compelling? Obviously I know you'd worked with each of them, I think separately, is that right?
Yes.
And they'd worked together as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I worked with Mike on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and I developed a pilot with Ed in his company, Pacific Electric. We're all pretty silly. I think it's weird. Sometimes two of us will like something the other one doesn't, but we're very respectful of like, if someone feels very passionate about something, it goes in. I'm trying to think. I think we all really, I remember the movie Arthur came up for no reason, and we all really liked Arthur. And like we were talking about how, I think it was off the Kaufman character, like, can you still have a funny drunk? Like, is that even allowed in this day and age? And we were talking about just how much we loved the movie Arthur. But yeah, it's weird because I mean, Mike he wrote on SNL like when I was obsessed with SNL. So sometimes I'll mention stuff and he'll be like, oh yeah, I wrote that. Just like, are you kidding? It's like so crazy. And then obviously Ed Helms, I mean, he's just like a comedy god. So I think it's kind of this weird thing where I like the comedy they make because they were so formative in my life. But then I also think we just like to make each other laugh. I think a lot of times ego can get in the way of telling really funny stories, but it really isn't that in our room. It's just sort of the funniest pitch wins. And I've been in rooms where people say that and it's not true, but like it actually is true in our room. And it's lovely.
Well, and so walking right into room culture then, because people love hearing about rooms. So, after all this time, I want to be clear for this particular accolade, you are the first Native American showrunner, I think.
Yeah.
In the States, in which that's where the vast majority of shows are originating, which is amazing. So after all this time, how do you run your room? What have you done or brought along from other places, or what kind of a room do you like? What now that it's yours, how do you like it to be?
Yeah, I mean, I worked in some really great rooms. I've really been very lucky. I don't have a lot of like war stories, and even if I did, for the times that I was working in them, they were very good. So, but I remember my first job being a show called Happy Endings, and that was, there were like 18 writers in that room. It was a really big room, and there were a lot of teams, and there were 10 staff writers. It was like one of 10 staff writers. They called it America's Next Top Staff Writer. It was just like a very feral, but very fun, a little fratty room. But I loved having these seasoned upper levels that loved to teach and loved to they loved television, and all they wanted to do was talk about it and analyze other shows. And there was just that wonderful hang. And then you had all these sort of young, eager young people, because the show was about single people in Chicago, who were just like eager to tell their stories and eager to kind of share and pitch and write jokes. And so I always loved that room. And I feel like every show I've worked on has like a series of like sort of chips, and the shows I love to work on are the ones where like everyone feels like they have a chip. Like I can look at an episode and remember that was me and that was me. And I've worked on shows where it's like, it's all that guy and he took all the chips, And so I always really like working on shows where everyone feels invested in it and feels like they're a part of it. And so really that happy endings model, mixed with a lot of stuff I learned from people like Emily Kapnick and different showrunners, is sort of the room that I tried to build. So like good hours, respecting people's time, and really trying to create a space where everyone can talk, everyone feels free to share and feels free to like look stupid and ask dumb questions. And it's just like a very respectful room, but also a room where like it's funny and you have real jokes and you have real hard comedy.
I am going to take that that metaphor with the chips along with me, because that's a really good one. But for those who don't know, Sierra, can you just kind of tell us who it was that we just saw in that clip there? We heard the names Nathan and Terry and Bobby.
Sure. So Nathan Rutherford, played by Ed Helms, is the last descendant of the Rutherford family, which the town Rutherford Falls is named after. He is sort of a fastidious museum owner. I feel like throughout the Northeast, there are hundreds of these sort of tiny museums all commemorating random people in American history that are completely devoted to just sort of random people. And he's someone who runs that museum. And sort of season one, Nathan is very much committed, and so much of his identity is really connected to the history of his family. And then his assistant is Bobby Yang, played by Jesse Lee. And his sort of foe is this guy, Terry Thomas, who is CEO of a casino on Minnesota Nation, which is a fictional nation, who really has sort of these like big grand plans, not only for the casino, but also for the nation as a whole, and is sort of seeing things kind of, he's playing like 4-dimensional chess and kind of has to convince Nathan to get on board with his plan in this episode.
So in that clip, we have Nathan, the family guy, the heritage guy, being told by Terry, the member of Minnesota Nation, that the details of history don't matter, and it's fine, it's kind of all the same and whatnot. How long did you have that particular clip up on the board, knowing that that was going to be a part of some episode or other?
I mean, that was in the pitch. Like we talked for over a year and really had the whole season broken out and pitched the season as a whole, season one. So that was definitely a part that we remembered, and the idea of turning like a white man into a mascot and sort of making a cartoon out of their image was something we were very tickled by, especially it being played by Ed Helms.
And so I want to ask you a little bit about Nathan, because, it would be easy to categorize him as sort of a clueless white dude. But it's as early as in the teaser, we see Nathan stammer over why they didn't bronze any of the Minnetonka who made the agreement and the treaty. And so he kind of knows on some level that he and the Rutherfords got the best end of the deal. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, for sure.
And yet his best friend, Regan, who we are about to meet, is of course also a member of Minnetonka Nation and cares very much about her heritage and her people. What do you think the conversations between those two have looked like over time? We see some of them, but yeah, how have they processed this sort of disparity over the years?
Yeah, I think like I always kind of liken it to a lot of conversations I have in writers' rooms, because most of the writers' rooms I've been in have been mostly with white men, and there's occasional people of color, but where you know, especially starting out, it was mostly lower level writers where they're well-meaning, they are kind, they champion you, they are deep, really good friends of yours, and will to your face say it's some of the most like biggest blind spots and have these moments of kind of just what, you know. And I think because I think those conversations definitely happen, but I don't know if they always permeate. And I think that the changes are so glacial. However, in the situation of writers' rooms, because we have such shared goals and such shared interests, it's hard not to just kind of go along to get along in those situations. And I think because they're both in small towns, because they've been childhood friends, there's probably not a lot of museum folks in those small towns. I think that they are able to kind of really bro out on a lot of the museum aspects of their job and their life. And then these sort of touchier subjects, I believe, we always talk about their friendship sort of being like kind of atrophied. And then this decision to not move the statue sort of opens them both up in different ways. And so I think a lot of the conversations that they have are sort of kind of Midwestern nice, brushed under the rug. And I think that because he is friends with Regan, that is the most aware he is. That him without her, I can't even imagine. And I think her without him, I think it would be very difficult for her to have survived in a town where she's very disliked. So they both offer such great positives for each other. And it's really like these two nerds against the world is how I always see them. But in the same way that you kind of have like codependency, it's like, are they holding each other back or are they keeping each other up? And so that's sort of the questions we ask in the season.
Right, because the Regan character is a deeply exciting character. I think we say this a lot about every show, but she's not somebody we have seen on TV very often. Can you describe her a little bit for us, for people who haven't already met Regan?
Sure. We always talk about how Nathan was sort of like born on third base and thought he hit a home run. And Regan is sort of in the stands, just like trying to get onto the field. And so she's someone who's incredibly capable. She loves her nation. She is from her nation. She left a man at the altar in order to go to Northwestern. She has 2 degrees, a master's in museum studies, and she came back really eager to start a museum the same way. There's a joke where she says to Nathan, she's like, we always talked about having museums since we were kids, and after I left to go get my master's degree and came back, you had a museum. And it's like sort of this thing of you know, because Nathan comes from wealth, even though he is not wealthy, he is afforded this sort of privilege, whereas Regan is just trying to get in the game. And so she runs a small cultural center that is currently located in her casino, and she's really trying to kind of have more. And in the pilot, you see her presenting this huge presentation to Terry, asking for more funds. And she's sort of a woman who is afraid to kind of take up space until it absolutely has to happen. And when she does, all of these sort of amazing things happen to her.
At the risk of being tacky by quoting you back to you, my arguably my favorite line that tells us so much about Regan in the pilot is the line where Terry says, yeah, you didn't go Ivy League, but so close it kills you. And it just, that's delicious because you can see it all over her face.
Yeah, she wants this thing, and she wants so much, and she's trying so hard, and she's just constantly swimming upstream. And played by Janice Schmieding, I mean, she was a writer in our writers' room who we ended up casting as the lead or co-lead. And she, when I wrote the studio to kind of introduce her, I just said, like, it's impossible not to root for her. And I truly believe that with that character. She just really embodies that element of Regan.
So you were not trying to cast from your writing staff, because that also can get in trouble productivity-wise. But were you doing other auditions and then knew, no, this is our woman right here?
We saw lots and lots of actors. There was an embarrassment of riches. Like I was told for many years trying to get Native projects off the ground in LA that there just isn't the infrastructure. There aren't enough writers, there aren't enough actors. And like, we just never found that to be true. But you know, Mike and Ed both came from The Office, where like so many of the writers were also actors. And so it was kind of decided that like all the writers should audition. So almost, I think, you know, Bobby Wilson, who plays Wayne, was in our writer's room season 1. And I was like, oh yeah. And Jana was excited to read for Sally, because she was like, oh yeah, like on TV, people who look like me play Sally, you know. And she killed it. She killed that audition. But we were like, you should read for Regan. And she just nailed it. She just was, so many of the jokes jumped off the page, and she's so naturally funny. And she, you know, she studied improv in New York for many years and is theater trained. And so she just is like lightning in a bottle in many ways. And so she just kind of kept moving up. And then we had a screen test at NBC, and she got into a car accident on the way there. It was like the only day it rains in LA. And I had left 2 hours early because anytime it rains, I was like, I'm going to get into an accident. And she called while I was on the 134, and she was like, I've been in an accident. She's like, she didn't hurt anyone or hit anyone. She hit a wall, and she was like, I don't know what to do. And so I like flipped a bitch and went over and got her, and we like abandoned her car. We like left the scene of a crime, made it to the screen test, and then she got it. But it was one of those things where it was like, it just felt meant to be in so many ways.
Yeah, that's absolutely worth it for that story alone. So I kind of have a two-part question for you. The first part is, even though we hear that, you know, that Regan left Ray at the altar, or more or less at the altar, and that she, you know, she went to grad school, and that's sort of why people don't like her, or she lives in town or whatever, we get the impression that maybe it goes deeper than that or sooner than that. Do you think that's true, or is that Regan's story that she's telling herself, that like she's always sort of been the outsider, as you say, that she and Nathan are sort of the museum dorks, irrespective of sort of their cultural families and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not from my reservation. I lived there for a couple of years when I was very little. And so, but I have family members who I think when you leave and go to college and you come back, they're just culturally speaking, and obviously we're not a monolith, so this is not to paint with, this is painting with a broad brush, but there's a feeling that a lot of the writers talked about of having to pay your dues and having to get your way back into the community. And it's not just a given when you come back, because you've chosen to leave, and that there are people who have chosen to stay and really fortify the community. And so I think in the second episode, I think most TV shows written by white people would be like, yeah, that town is bad for expecting Regan to sort of play this game and chop wood. And Terry Thomas's character is like, no, like you worked so hard to get through Northwestern, and you did all these side hustles, and why are you willing to work so hard for them and not for us? Like, why are we any different? And I think to me, that was like a concept that was brought up in the writer's room that we're like, oh my God, that's so juicy, and not something I've totally seen, which is to like defend the community's opinion of her. So I think it's a little bit as a metaphor for her own insecurity, but I also think there are like cultural norms where you have to, I mean, every time I go back home, it's, are you weaving and chop wood? It's not, you know, I could win an Emmy and they wouldn't care. It's like, but did you weave? And did you, you know, do you have a rug, and what are you doing? So I think it's just a different value system, and both are valid.
And for sure. But yeah, no matter how sort of high Regan goes in one avenue of things, it doesn't necessarily sort of, calculate, as you say, to the values of the community.
Totally.
But that kind of,
outwardly lovable, I think she ends up earning a lot of people's respect over time. There's a lot of little wins that she gets that are so meaningful to her.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because you said a few minutes ago, you know, it's impossible not to like her. And I think that's true. Yeah. And to root for her, and, you know, and to want everybody to be like, they should like her, and so forth. And of course, she, you know, she's kind of up against it, where Nathan is yes, more privileged than she. And then she has this job opportunity, and she has, spoiler, a hot boyfriend, and so forth. Was it hard for you not to give Regan all the things, and to make her, because when we don't get to see somebody on camera that often who looks like Regan, or who's in her position, we often want to be like, have all the things, be happy, you know, was it hard to still go, no, we still have to kind of put her through the ringer?
That's so interesting. I really felt like she did get a hot boyfriend, and she did have all these experiences. I think she gets, you know, it's a TV show, we have to have many episodes. So I feel like the nature of television is you can't just be like, and it all worked out for everyone, you know, at the end of the season. But I think if you look at where she's at the end of the season, where Nathan is, I mean, we very much designed it to sort of be as one ascends, one is descending, and they still, you know, work on their friendship and still have this connection to each other. But I don't totally find myself seeing that she got put through the ringer so much as like, this is reflective of what it's like to be in a Native community. Like, and to the more you are kind of, the more you are putting yourself out there, the more you have a target on you. And the people like Terry Thomas are like, and that's good. And we need to like represent, and we need to show up. And I think she does, she like stands up for herself, and her sort of like personal victory of standing up for herself in the Crabs in a Bucket episode, I think is a little indicative of that.
Oh, absolutely. And I meant put her through the ringer in the sense of, you know, being the lead in the show. That, you know, those are the people we want to see stuff happen to, you know.
Totally.
Which is exciting. But you said something a little while ago about that I've seen you quoted saying, you know, of course, that Native peoples, Indigenous peoples are not a monolith. And so my question to you is whether there was anything that surprised you in the writer's room. Is it safe to assume that this is one of the first times you were in a writing room with many other Native people? That doesn't happen a lot. And so were there things that surprised you or surprised the other writers that you know were disagreements, or that were debates about how to depict or what to show, or those kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, we would just have debates in the room about like capitalism or casinos, or like I grew up, you know, as I said, with my mom, and we lived rug to rug for many years until my dad went through college. And I see commerce as such a expression of like who I am, and having a business, and seeing my mom as this like very strong businesswoman negotiating with like bankers and people who own the San Diego Padres. And so the idea of business I was always very drawn to, and found a lot of Native identity in that, in her occupation, in addition to her being an artist. And Jana, who is an incredible beadwork artist, will bead and make stuff that, I mean, I was a beader before I was a weaver, and it's incredible. Like, her beadwork is incredible, and it's funny. Like, I would have hired her off of her beadwork, honestly. And she'll just give it away. Like, she'll just give it away because she loves doing it, and she loves the way it feels. And it's more of like a meditative thing for her, and her relationship to the beadwork is different. And she sells it sometimes, but she didn't see it in the same way where, like, I was drinking coffee when I was 8 years old, beading, trying to stay up as late as I could to make as many pieces as I could. It's a very different relationship. And so when we would talk about that in the room, I'm like, well, that's just crazy. Like, I couldn't really wrap my head around it. And we were like, oh, I'm Terry Thomas, like, what is his counterpart? And that's sort of where we came up with the Terry Thomas episode, was while he is just so good at navigating these different spaces, when he's at home, he has provided a life for his daughter where she doesn't have to struggle and she doesn't have to hustle, and that grind culture is not inside her. And it just drives him insane, because that's the tradition he thought he would be passing on, and she just doesn't want it. And like, what do we do? But the thing she is doing is very traditional. It's very traditional to make pieces and to give gifts and to create community and to learn from your elders. And so it was such a cool opportunity to have that conversation in the room, and then have so many Native characters we could extrapolate that conversation, and then have a white character who can be on both of their sides, and have, you know, Regan who's there, and just for comic relief. Like, it was just insane to have a situation where you had 4 Native characters who had completely different perspectives on this one issue.
And that you don't have to come down on one side or another.
No, because in our communities and in our families, we rarely are able to do that. We have different opinions depending on who's at your dinner table.
Imagine that. It definitely did seem to me as though the show had a real affection for those with a side hustle. I want to spend hours and hours on Bobby later on. Did you know from jump that Terry was going to be such an iconic character? Clearly you crafted him that way, but were you sure on the page or in the pitch, or when did he sort of come alive for you?
Yeah, I mean, I remember that character sort of existing in the initial kind of papers that Mike and Ed had given to me, and I was like, oh no, this guy's all wrong. I was like, this guy rules. Like I just sort of described him as like sort of like a native Mark Cuban, and I had a very specific idea of who he was and his ability to sort of code switch, and he was a great dad and a great family man, and we just started crafting him. And then as the room got together, especially for the native writers, I feel like we were very precious about his character and really the aspirational aspects of him, but also those are elements of like uncles that we had. And we talked a lot with Michael about uncle energy, and he immediately got what we were talking about. And Terry sort of Valentine to uncles, and Regan sort of a Valentine to aunties, and how those both are positions in our communities that are sort of the glue of our communities. And so, yeah, I don't want to brag and be like, I knew, but like when we wrote him, we were just so excited and hopeful that we would find this person who could play him. And then when we screen tested Michael very late in the process, and he just showed up and was like Terry, and we're like, holy shit, this is going to work. And it was so wonderful to see him just really embody those words and really grow as an actor. And comedy is not his first sort of love, but he has always wanted to be in a sitcom. He was like, it's always been my goal to do a sitcom, and he really just killed it. So yeah, I think I knew that character was someone who was gonna just rule, but like in terms of the execution, you just never know.
The way that he speaks, even though that is the only episode that is sort of solely devoted to Terry's POV, the way that he speaks, you kind of have a real idea of his perspective all the time, every day. You can hear it in the way that he deals with the lawyers. He is sort of rolling out his I'm going to be cool and deadly with lawyers, in the way that he sort of sizes up his the locker of crafts and artifacts and things was when there's a point where Terry chooses exactly which native artifacts and jewelry and pieces he's going to wear for maximum effect. And it does a lot. And yeah, you really get the idea that this is Terry's world, and we're just living in it.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I think what's good about the Terry Thomas episode is you think that and you realize he could be taken down by his teenage daughter. Like he's still like a human being, which is nice. I don't know. There's so many dramas that I will not name check, but a lot of drama set in New York will do these episodes where like someone who owns a casino shows up and is sort of like the person that gets you through your back 9 of your season. And it's just so annoying, and they could be played by like wooden spoons, and they're just like evil and they make no sense. And they always bother me because I'm always like, if you meet people who work at casinos and who are these types of businessmen, because working at the National Museum of the American Indian, you would have a lot of interaction with people like this. That's not how they are. Like, that's just not the way they're depicted, is never how they are. They're never like mustache twirly, because Native people can't grow mustaches, but like they're just not, those people. They have so much more depth and layers. And I always thought, like, if you could ever do that character correctly, it would just be the coolest thing ever. And so what I love about, I feel like Nathan has a blind spot as to like his sort of value is sort of heightened, and Regan is almost too hard on herself, but Terry is like very aware of not just who he is, but how he is perceived. And I think that that's something that in this day and age is just very enticing. I think it's almost like an Obama thing where like, he's very aware of how the narratives have been written about people who look like him specifically. And he's able to really swim in those waters where I think everyone else is kind of just like dog paddling, trying to survive.
And so, you mentioned he can be taken down by his teenage daughter, but he's going sort of knuckle to knuckle with the lawyers, with sort of the casino conferencers who are already implementing something so mythical and magical that I couldn't quite even wrap my head around the concept. But what do you think is the thing that sticks in the craw of somebody like Terry, who in theory has made it, has had a lot of financial success, who's sort of preaching about hustling, has done him very well, and who, he's, even when he is lecturing Regan about who to be, it works. Like, she benefits from his sort of teaching. So what's Terry's fatal flaw? Or what do you think is the thing that bothers him the most?
What do I think that bothers Terry the most? I mean, I think when you are a person, I think, I don't know if I'm the only one who feels this, but as a Native person, I just always wake up being like, this should all be ours. Like, it's an absurd experience to be a Native person because you are walking on the land that all once was yours, even though we don't own anything. And I think there's a feeling of the 7 generations that he wants to do everything he can now to ensure the prosperity of his people and of his nation and of his family. And I think what bothers him is anything that kind of circumvents that or slows that down. I think he also, in certain points of the show, being underestimated. And I think really the sort of offense he feels by being underestimated by Rutherford Inc. and these sort of bigger companies. He's excited for the fight and seeing them not give him his due. So I think he's a very, like, you know, I mean, we say he like taught dirty dancing classes and he brags about winning trophies at the country club. So I think, you know, he has a little bit of that kind of, he's got some vanity to him for sure. And I think that's why Regan is such a great character, because she's not afraid of him and she will always poke him and tell him when he's doing something wrong. And I think he actually like just wants to be this sort of sharper weapon, and anything that kind of dulls him, I think gets him annoyed.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that she's, you know, she's not afraid of him. And she's also not, we see him do a lot of kind of dazzling. And ironically, I think that's something that Nathan does in a way, in the or dazzling you with just facts and heritage and names and things of Rutherford's. There's a great line that says, you know, that great American pastime is gaining power.
Oh,
and I've kind of misphrased it there. But it seems to me that there are a lot of people on this show who are, in one way or another, in pursuit of power. I'm thinking about Nathan, or who doesn't want to lose power. Again, coming back to Bobby, I will absolutely buy the novelization of Bobby's backstory anytime you want to. But also there's Regan, who's almost powerful, almost against her will. And of course there's Terry, and then there's Deirdre. So I wonder whether, are you, as you're looking towards season 2 and so forth, are you consciously sort of passing the power around, or is it more obvious that this is everybody's pursuit, or are we going elsewhere?
Can't really say specifically. I think we talk a lot about legacy, and I think what's interesting about Nathan's character is when we end, spoiler alert, when we end the season, his legacy is truly in question. And so it's sort of exploring who is that person now, and what does that person do, you know, in their day. And then you have characters who have a lot of power by the end of the season, and it's sort of like, how do you maintain and how do you continue to prosper? So I think, to me, it's a little bit of a mixture of power, but also just legacy. I mean, so much of the show is about whose American stories do we get to tell and whose do we not. And I think there is a lot of power in that national narrative. I think, to me, they're synonymous, but it's a little bit different.
And so, in a kind of related question, there's a great line where Regan says, you know, I only have the bandwidth to be pissed off at one white guy today. Mm-hmm. And, you know, because she's pissed off at Nathan, Josh kind of is off the hook for the moment. Are we going to get to see her increase her bandwidth to be pissed off at many people, or is it kind of not her bag? Because she's a pretty chill pissed off too.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Regan, it's a lot about taking up space. I think when I worked at the museum, you feel such a responsibility to represent, but it's also just exhausting to be the only person doing a specific job in an industry that's always predominantly white. And so I think we're going to kind of watch her kind of figure out, like, what does having it all look like? Like, what does that exactly feel like on a daily basis?
We are going to go to questions in just a few minutes, but before that, I have a couple more of my own. And of course, if there's anything that we've been skating over that you're like, by the way, I wanted to go back here, I would love to hear it.
No, this is so lovely.
But I wanted to ask you about something, and I'm just scrolling here for it. But here's who we have kind of in this show. We have Nathan, Regan, Terry, Bobby, Deirdre, and then Does. Sierra, tell us about the name Does. Nathan's brother. What's it short for? What's it coming from?
It's short for dozen, I believe. This is from the pitch because he is the 12th descendant of Lawrence Rutherford. And so like each oldest son is named Lawrence. And so his name is like Larry Does Rutherford. So it's just a nickname that Nathan gives him. And so it was sort of an example of, yes. So Nathan's brother is a lawyer and he couldn't give a shit about sorry if I'm allowed to curse. He doesn't care at all about his legacy or the Rutherford name. And Nathan, who's the second born, it's his whole life is talking about and preserving the legacy of this family.
Does right, like Trey or Trip. Those are for people who are the third, or if it's Skip, that means you were named after your grandfather, but not your father, etc. Does. I love it. It's amazing. Okay. And then I did want to ask whether it was a conscious effort for you guys to have this show make us so hungry so much of the time. In Ontario, in this part of Canada, there's no PF Chang's, so there was a full envy there. But we also got rhubarb pie, there was bagels, there was Skittles, I believe there was commentary about yogurt. Is it what you were eating when you were story editing the scripts, or what was it craft that day?
I don't know. I think, it was a lot of the Native writers' first writers' room experience. And if, as you well know, in a room, the way they keep us there for hours is to just feed us like the most insane foods. And so especially a first season show, you have all these people sending like cookies and stuff, but we're a food friendly room. We all like to eat. And it was funny because we had PF Chang's in the History Day episode, and Ed Helms, I think, must have eaten like 4 platters of orange chicken. Like he took it down and I was like, you don't have to eat the whole time. He's like, no, I'm good. It was a family affair. And I remember I had a very stressful day because there's so much prop food. And the prop person's Michael Glenn, who's incredible, was like, yeah, this is all edible. And I was like, can I have this? And I just took a shrimp fried rice and like ate it in a corner because it was, so yeah, we're a food friendly room.
And you're like, here I am. Now this is my own show that I'm running.
Representation matters. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay. We're receiving a question here that I'll start with, which is a great question. And it reads, from the outside, the film and television industry can seem very complex, impersonal, and mechanical. How do you carve a space out for yourself where you can feel some sense of individuality within that system?
Individuality, that's interesting. I mean, I will say, to me, TV writing, there was this guy, David O. Sachs, I think his name is, he came to speak to one of the mini panel fellowships I was in. But he was saying it's like a homemade business. This is still a homemade business. It's like the one business they haven't automated yet. Like it's still people in a room banging their heads against the wall with a whiteboard, breaking stories, sharing their most personal stories, and some sort of alchemy plus snacks allows us to tell these stories. So for me, I really like the community aspect of television writing. I've never written a feature. It sounds incredibly lonely. And everyone I know who does it, I'm like, I don't know how you do it. So I would push back a little bit on the idea that it's impersonal, or mechanical. However, once it's made, it's turned into this business that is sometimes very ugly and very mechanical. I think you should always be trying to write your own stuff. And I think I didn't do that enough early in my career, but I kept a journal for many years. And I still do. And that really does help me kind of remember where I was last year, or kind of especially like a work journal that I keep that helps me to kind of keep my thoughts in order of what the goals were, 6 months ago. And sometimes you get a little lost. But that's specific to the project, I think. And then also just going home, we go home a lot and we see my mom. I FaceTime my mom every I mean, it's been harder with the pandemic, but I think keeping ties to your actual community is always key for me, or building community where you are.
Well, speaking of building community, and I know this is not necessarily the type that you meant, but you mentioned one of your first gigs, there were 10 staff writers, which is sort of the entry level writing gig for those who haven't done it. And I wonder whether you feel, as much as that sort of must have felt like it was itself a bit of a Game of Thrones, do you still keep up with people who you met when you were starting out? Because I think often what can alleviate loneliness is for writers to have people who know what's going on in the process with them and kind of going along with them. And so I'm curious about whether there are people who you can point to as like, yeah, we came up together, or we understood each other in these ways?
Yeah, there's been writers' rooms where like we talk all the time and we're like consistently always together. Like there's girls from a writer's room who like threw my baby shower. There's like people who I'm very tight with. There's people where we haven't spoken in 10 years and we see each other and it's exactly like what it was. Like we don't even have to like, it's incredible, that connection. And you see it a lot too on like, I mean, like people, I've seen this with like SNL writers and things like that, where it's like a fraternity. And so, yeah. And I think there's also like a lot of, for lack of a better word, like diversity writers who I've been on panels with, and I'm like, oh, you're going through the same thing I'm going to. Like I remember a Latina writer who reached out to me and was like, well, we'll never be in a room together. So do you want to go get brunch? Because we'll never hire two Latina writers. And I was like, yeah, definitely. And so there's a weird kind of community of people who are kind of very like-minded, and it really helps, especially when you're trying to find jobs, or when like I'm a part of this group called the Untitled Latinx Project, which is a group of Latine women identifying writers who are showrunner level. And I learned so much about like, you have to get a publicist, or this is what this is what you have to yell about in this moment, or this is what casting is for a pilot. And so you kind of, you do build those communities for sure. And you get like emails, like random emails, like this guy Prentice Penny, who ran Insecure, was a producer. He was the only other writer of color on Happy Endings when I was a staff writer. And I will constantly text him and be like, this is normal, right? And he's like, totally normal. Or he'll be like, no, don't do that, or whatever. And we'll kind of go back and forth. And whenever like I wrote something for the New York Times, he would, text me back and be like, this is really good. And so it's weird, the kind of connections that you end up making and that just stay forever.
Because often those are the only people who understand the ridiculously of this job, of the, as you, what did you say, the homemade industry that is also
industry, yeah.
No, that's amazing. There's a question here. How did you get the Hallucination, formerly A Tribe Called Red, to co-compose for the original soundtrack? Whose idea was it to approach them to work on the soundtrack?
We knew we wanted to have Native composers, co-composers, and we knew that we wanted them to be of the region. So I talked to some of the Native writers, and they pitched them, and Bear had done a lot of really amazing experimental short films at Imaginative when I was programming films. And so he would DJ a lot of those film festivals, and I just loved him, and he knew me a little bit. It was like kind of like a back in the day, like, oh yeah, and so we ended up reaching out to them formally. But they knew some writers in the writer's room, because before the show came out, there was obviously a lot of skepticism about like, what is this? Because, it had really never been the way it is now. So we reached out, I remember, on Instagram, and I had to be like, I don't know if you remember me, but like in 2009, like we met. He's like, yeah, I remember you. And so he's like, let's look into it and we'll see. And so they like, looked at the material, and they had a lot of, they're both amazing artists, but they are also incredibly connected to community and their value system in that way. Like they really are just goals. And so they, kind of took all the data and decided if they wanted to do it, and they were down. And I'm so glad, like what they added to the show is it's immeasurable. And they're so funny and so sweet and just incredibly talented.
That's amazing. And once again, you've kind of walked up to the edge of the next question. You know how to do that. Somebody wants to know, and this may or may not be related. Were you wary of mixing serious issues and moments in with the laughs?
I think I was very hyper aware. We had, Bobby Wilson is a part of the 1491s. And I feel like that sketch group does an incredible job of talking about serious issues, but also poking fun at them, and that nothing is off the table in terms of being funny as a Native person. So I think the sort of adage of our room was, as long as we're in on the joke, we will joke about anything, and we'll never punch down, and we'll never kind of we're not making fun of us, we're laughing at us and the situation, if that makes any sense. So we're never being laughed at. We are the ones laughing. And in my community and the community of the other Native writers on our show, that is how we deal with the hardships, the hardest moments I can imagine. True tragedies in my family. there was always someone cracking a joke or bringing some levity to the situation or finding some sort of wordplay or pun. And oftentimes that's, to me, so enmeshed with those issues that to sort of keep them separate didn't totally make sense to us. And then I also think we felt a lot of responsibility at the time as sort of the first to leave it all out on the field. So I was like, if I get to make what I believed at the time was the first Native TV show, I'm doing everything. I was like, we're going to do a This Is Us, and we're going to do a rom-com, and we're going to do like a Secession, and we're going to do, because I knew we all had those stories in us and we were capable of it. And I wanted people to know, like, we can do this. We can do all of these stories and more. So I was definitely hyper aware, and it was a constant calibration, but we didn't want to not put everything out there.
And actually, you made me think, how do you feel about the sort of increasingly blurry line of what constitutes half-hour television? It used to be that a comedy is a half hour and a drama is an hour, and that's it. Thank you very much. And with streamers like your lovely home at Peacock and all kinds of other things, there's a lot more. Nobody likes the word dramedy. We all pretend it doesn't exist. But a half hour can be kind of whatever you want it to be, including 19 minutes or 35 minutes. So how has that affected you, or how do you feel about that?
I think there was a time just as a viewer, this is my own personal opinion, where like comedies were sort of bloated and a little too long, and a little like, I think there were certain shows that could have been like 3 minutes shorter, and coming up in network television where you had to kind of tell a story in 22 minutes and you would be constantly cutting. It was always so hard. And so I always really like shows where it feels tight and it feels very cohesive. But I also grew up on shows like A Different World and like Designing Women, where people would just have huge monologues and very special episodes, and they would tackle things like, I remember, I don't know if you've ever seen A Different World, but there was an episode where Dwayne and Whitley, their honeymoon, they got to go to LA, and it was like during the LA riots. And so it was like, it was hard hitting, talking about the LA riots, talking about police brutality, but then they ended up going into a store and it was getting looted by Roseanne Barr and Tom Arnold, which is just such a crazy, like wacky thing to do. And then they like go back into very serious stuff, or Designing Women. It was like the silliest sillies. And then Ms. Sugarbaker would like tell a monologue explaining feminism, explaining abortion rights, explaining gay rights. And so I loved those shows. I loved the ability to kind of vacillate between the two. And so I really I'm weirdly like more judgy about other shows. And then getting to make one, I was like, nope, we're going to do everything and we're not going to worry about it as much. But I mean, even like, again, Insecure, which I think is a show that has drama to it, it's sitcom writers writing those shows. And so it's very tight, and it's the way the story is broken is very structured. And, but I think, I don't know, TV is really just opening up and can be so many things, but I'm partial to that traditional network television, especially because you've never gotten to see Native people like be in 30 Rock or be on Wings or be on. So I'm like, my dream is like a Native multicam. That's like my next dream, is just doing like a straight, like Native Cheers or Native Taxi. Like, what does that look like? But I think every version of it has value. It's just what you are drawn to.
There are actually several real piercing monologues in season 1 of Rutherford Falls. But if you were making that 3-camera show, do you know what that monologue would be? Can you picture it in your head as everybody kind of, all those big old head cams push in?
Maybe, I don't know. Like, I think the sky is sort of ours. I don't have it yet, but I could get it for you. But no, I mean, I think we always talked about, I love montages and Mike loves monologues. And so it was his pitch that Terry should have a monologue like every episode. And the only way I got my montages often would be to be like, and here's the Terry monologue. But those are like the most fun to write, because it's like, Michael Grayes talks a lot about like Terry getting to say the stuff that his parents whispered and sort of said under their breath. And that really hit me when he said that, of like, he gets to say the stuff you always want to say, in certain situations.
And probably there's Mara Brocka-Keel is a showrunner who she did Girlfriends, she did Being Mary Jane, all kinds of things. And she said once that she had, when she got Girlfriends, a thick notebook of all the things, all the pitches that had been shot down in a room, all the things that the the white and well-meaning showrunners did not understand, or the things that, when you pitch them, somebody says, nobody would do that. And you're going, well, my family did constantly.
All the time.
Did you have sort of a hit list of things that you knew you wanted to make it into this season? As you said, none of us know what's going to be next season or what that will be. So you kind of leave it all on the floor. Did you have sort of a list of things of like, we're definitely doing this, 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 and this?
Yeah, I think like talking about repatriation was very important, having worked in museums and learned so much through different documentaries that we had programmed. I didn't think you could talk about museum spaces for Native people without talking about repatriation. Land back and land issues obviously are just something that I think is so embedded. Capitalism, and Tazo Chavez sort of introduced the concept of tribal capitalism and the difference of that. So that wasn't something that I came in with, but as she spoke about it, really helped. Oh, is that okay? As she spoke about it, I think obviously like Native art. Are you okay? I think you might have, yeah, okay. And I think that there's other stuff. And then also just like casinos that it's weird. I think Native people are exhausted by casino narratives, and then we've never actually seen one on a television show like made by us. So it's just like this weird sort of dichotomy. We talked a lot about like Native people are exhausted by certain stereotypes that white people aren't even aware of, and sort of kind of walking in that space of how do we exhibit these things without bumming out the Native audience. So there were a lot of sort of adages and ideas, but yeah, I think I had a list of stuff for sure. And then also just getting to do like inside joke comedy. There's these like 1%ers that, often showrunners always get to put in. And it was just nice to be in a position where you're like, nope, that's just going to go in and that's fine.
Well, it's odd to follow that amazing answer of yes, here's all the things I triumphed by, including this question, which I swear it's from the audience, who ask, what is a mistake that you've made in your career that you learned the most from?
Oh man. What is a mistake that I made in my career? I think I had to get therapy when I realized like that the job was too difficult for me to operate in. And I think if I had gotten, I've always been in therapy, but one of the things I learned about was just asking for reassurance, that when you ask your superiors for reassurance, you're introducing the idea that you're incapable. Whereas if you really live in that discomfort and just bet on yourself a little bit, your stock will actually rise in that room. The emotional currency you earn in that room is so much higher. And so my first few years in a writer's room, I spent a lot of time being like, is that okay? Did you like that? Or I'm so sorry I did that. And then being like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And realizing now, especially as a showrunner, how busy you are, you don't really have time for the emotional sort of needs of other people. But the more you can kind of present yourself as self-sufficient and live in the discomfort of, I don't know if these people like me, but I'm just going to keep working hard. I wish I'd learned that sooner.
Well, you mentioned in passing, as a showrunner, you have to hire a publicist and so forth. We've been talking about taking up space. Even though we all work under showrunners, nobody really teaches you how to do it. What are the things that you want people to know coming up behind you about, like, here are the things you just have to do or step right into or not apologize for in terms of?
I mean, I think if you're a BIPOC showrunner, it's just going to be harder. It's going to be harder because you not only have to tell a great story, you have to explain everything to everyone, not just, the studio and the network, but also the press. And you have to find sort of like ways to articulate very specific experiences. My friend said that there's this thing called like a showrunner worm, that the second you become a showrunner, a worm goes into your brain and eats one part of it. And it's either like the time management part or the ability to make a decision, or you get all these explanations and like, I'm sure, right? Like, and so I was hyper aware of that like the lack of sleep and the pressure, like you just wake up thinking like, I remember reading this article with Barry Levinson where when he was making Diner, he was saying like, when all of these grip trucks showed up, he was like, this is real important because trucks are here. There was something about the trucks that made it, I don't know. But I think it's just kind of like living in that stress and just make decisions as soon as you can, and you can always change your mind.
Yeah, it's that thing of on top of everything else and the worm eating your brain. Thank you for that image. Being unflappable, right? Like showing that you are deserving of this role that they've put you in.
Yeah, and I think you just have to carry yourself. I mean, I love when people ask me questions, so this is like a dream job for me. I was always a bossy pants as a child. But yeah, it's answering a lot of questions and really believing in the story you're telling.
Sadly, we are out of time for many stories that I would still like to ask about. I'm curious about whether the Marvel people have come after you for the line about Hawkeye. But do you know when we might be able to actually see season 2?
I have no idea. That is above my pay grade. We're writing them, and we'll soon be making them. And I really can't wait for everyone to see it.
Well, we are so excited as well. Sierra Teller Ornelas, thank you so much for your time with us and your candor and all of the really juicy, exciting things that we got to hear straight from you.
Thank you so much, Lana. Thank you for having me.